So today's video is about finding fractions, decimals, and percents. So what are fractions, decimals, and percents? Well, they are all numbers that represent a part of a whole or a portion of something. And we can take the same portion and we can show it as a decimal, we can show it as a percent, and we can show it as a fraction. So if I have this picture right now, and this is a hundredths grid, and if I were to color in 25 of the boxes, one way that I can show this is I can say that I've colored in 25 hundredths. Another way I can show this is I can say that I've actually colored in 25%. And another way I can show this as a fraction is saying that I've colored in 25 out of 100, and in simplest form that would be 1/4. So remember that fractions, decimals, and percents are all numbers that show a portion or a part of a whole. So how do we change in between fractions and decimals and percents? So this first example is how to change from decimals to percents and from percents to decimals. So the first thing we'll look at is how do you change a percent to a decimal. So to change a percent to a decimal, we're going to move the decimal 2 places backwards. So here's our first example, and we have 28%. Well, in order for us to change 28% to a decimal, we're going to take and cross out the percent sign and then move the decimal back 2 places, which will give us 2800. So 28% would be 28 hundredths. So then part B says that we have 9%. Again, we have to move the decimal 2 places backwards, which would be 9 hundredths. Another example, we have 125%, and that as a decimal would be 1.25 or 1 and 25 hundredths. And then we have 64.3%, and as a decimal that would be 643 thousandths or 0.643. So remember, to change a percent to a decimal, you move the decimal 2 places backwards. So if we want to change from a decimal to a percent, we're going to move the decimal 2 places forward. So if I have 36 hundredths and I want to change that to a percent, well, I know 36 hundredths as a percent would be 36%. Then if I have 2/10ths and I want to change that to a percent, again, I've got to move the decimal 2 places forward, and that would be 20%. Not 2%, but 20%. Then I have 2 and 51 hundredths. I want to change that to a percent. So then if I move the decimal 2 places forward, that would be 251%. And then I have 7 hundredths, and if I want to change that to a percent, I'm going to move the decimal 2 places forward, and that would be 7%. So when you're changing from decimals to percents or percents to decimal, you're basically moving the decimal either 2 places forward or 2 places backwards. And the way I remember whether I'm going to move forward or backwards is I think about the alphabet. So to go from the letter P to the letter D, you would have to go backwards on the alphabet. So that means you're going to have to move the decimal backwards. And to go from the letter D to the letter P, you would go forward on the alphabet, which means you'd have to move the decimal 2 places forward. So that's a quick trick to help you remember which direction to move the decimal. So this next example is how to change decimals to fractions and fractions back to decimals. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to divide the numerator by the denominator. So if we want to change a fraction to a decimal, we're going to have to divide. So I've been given this fraction 3/5, and I want to know what is 3/5 as a decimal. So the first thing I have to do is I have to set up my problem. So I've got to put the numerator inside the house and the denominator outside the house. And then when I divide 5 into 3, I'm going to have to add a decimal and a 0 and bring the decimal up, which will give me an answer of 6/10. So that means that 3/5 as a decimal would be 6/10. Now, if I want to change a decimal to a fraction, you can look at the number after the decimal, and that's going to become the numerator, and then the place value of the number is going to be your denominator. And one thing that I do is I actually say the number out loud, and if you say the number out loud, it pretty much gives you what the decimal will be. So we have 45 hundredths. So if I were to actually say the number out loud, 45 hundredths, then if I were to write that as a fraction, it would be 45 over 100. Or you can look at, after the decimal is the number 45, so that's going to be my numerator. And then this number is in the hundredths place, so that means my denominator would have to be 100. And then you want to simplify. always want to make sure that your fractions are in simplest form. So then this simplified would be 9 over 20. So then our last example is how to change from a fraction to a percent and a percent to a fraction. So if I'm going from a percent to a fraction, you're going to place the percent over 100 and simplify. So I have 70%. I want to know what is that as a fraction. So the first thing I do is I place the percent over 100. So I'm going to put 70 over 100. And then my next step is to simplify. And 70 and 100 can be divided by 10. So in simplest form, it would be 7 over 10 or 7/10. So 70% as a fraction is 7/10. Now to change from a fraction to a percent, you're going to change the fraction to a decimal by dividing, and then change the decimal to a percent by moving the decimal 2 places forward. So we're going to start with 2/5, and we want to know what this is as a fraction. So our very first step is to change the fraction to a decimal. So we're going to put our numerator in the house, denominator outside the house, and that means that we will have 4/10. So that means our fraction as a decimal is 4/10. So after we change the fraction to a decimal, we've got to take our decimal 4/10 and change it to a percent by moving the decimal 2 places forward. And so we move the decimal 2 places forward. That means 4/10 as a percent would be 40%. So just keep in mind that fractions, decimals, and percents are all numbers that are used to show a part or a portion of something, and you can show the same amount using a fraction, a decimal, or a percent, and it is possible to interchange between the three.